Hello, everyone. This is Karen Rotko-Wynn. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you on our webinar this afternoon. I'm Karen Rotko-Wynn, the Executive Vice President and West Division Manager with the Alfred Group, based in our Seattle office. And on behalf of the entire team here at the Alfred Group, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. I know many of you are familiar with our firm, but for those who are not, I'd like to offer a brief introduction of our work before we get started. The Alfred Group is a national full-service consulting firm working to strengthen the not-for-profit community. Since 1979, the Alfred Group has empowered more than 3,000 organizations around the world to grow, improve, and fulfill their missions. From our offices in Chicago, New York, and Seattle, we offer customized solutions in fundraising, strategic planning, organizational assessment, board governance, professional development, and more. We work with nonprofit organizations, corporations, associations, and foundations. Our main goal is to provide guidance, tools, and structures that help organizations realize their full potential and have the greatest community impact possible. You can find more information about us on our website at www.alfred.com. Today's webinar is titled Bleeding Hearts and Minds, New Research into How Nonprofit Employees Make Job Choices. Your presenter today is my colleague, Diane Knoepke. Diane is a Vice President with the Alfred Group based in our Chicago office, and she works with nonprofit organizations across sectors and across the country. Her expertise is in organizational strategy, corporate partnerships, impact measurement, philanthropy, and social innovation. Today, Diane will be sharing the results of her most recent research on the key drivers of nonprofit employee recruitment and retention. She's a graduate student at Northwestern University, and she conducted this research over the last 11 months. Today, we will receive and review the highlights of her findings. The full report will be posted on our website following this webinar. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and in addition to the report, we will post the recording on our website following the webinar. We will also share our slides with you, so please look for an email later today with all of these details, as well as a short survey that we are asking for your feedback and hope you will fill out. Everyone joining us right now is in a listen-only mode for the duration of this webinar. We will have time at the end of our presentation to take questions. However, if you have a question at any time during the webinar, please type your question. To type a question, simply click on the Q&A icon in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. That will open a window, and there you can type your question. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A at the end, and only the presenters will see your question. Lastly, we invite you to join us on Twitter throughout the webinar using the hashtag NPOStrength. We will be live tweeting and invite you to join the conversation there as well. So with that, let's get started. I'm happy to present to you my colleague, Diane Knoepke.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you for all of you who are joining us today. Just a bit of fair warning, my Midwestern tendency to sound a little nasal is ramped up a little today because I have the sniffles, so bear with me if I sneeze, but I am very excited to be sharing this information with you today and really appreciate you joining us to do that. So as you probably know firsthand, organizations across the nonprofit sector are facing increasing competition for the best, sharpest, most passionate talent to drive your missions forward. And your missions are as demanding as they may have ever been, as many nonprofit organizations find themselves in a race against time and scarcity to meet the needs of those you aim to serve. That race is won by the biggest, strongest hearts and most brilliant strategic minds. We know that our society relies on the nonprofit sector to create outcomes that corporations and governments cannot and will not. And depending on the scenario and your particular perspective, you could argue in many cases the nonprofit sector is doing things that the other sectors should not. The word outcomes is especially important here, as the expectations for social performance, a nonprofit's ability to deliver on its mission in a measurable way, are rightfully higher than ever. We don't want our nonprofits to just do good. We expect to actually get things done and make meaningful change while we do it. So in order to create those outcomes, our nonprofits lean heavily on our talent, which, as in most areas of the workforce, is increasingly hard to find and increasingly hard to keep. So what is really making it hard? There's a few factors that are creating extra urgency right now in our need to understand what motivates nonprofit talent to make job choices and to give their all or not to give their all to the jobs that they have. First, generational shifts in the workplace. When compared to the generations before them, millennials are showing signs of both a greater desire for meaningful and fulfilling work and expectations of higher compensation and expedited promotions. The conventional wisdom in nonprofits is that you usually get one of those at most. Second, jobs are increasingly non-standard. This can be great for employees looking for autonomy and flexibility, but it can also make it difficult for organizations to set expectations, manage to those expectations, and ensure equity and parity across a variety of job roles. Not only are employees leaving jobs sooner, employees are increasingly not actually employees, at least in a traditional sense. A larger number of individuals are crafting their careers outside of traditional job models, and this has roots in both voluntary and involuntary phenomena. Many individuals who found themselves without jobs, especially in 2009 or 2010, began to shape their livelihoods around short-term gigs, and many found that contract work was a good path forward for them. Also, entrepreneurship is on the rise, and with the rapid improvements in virtual teaming, digital connectivity, and the like, organizations have to compete with a lot of new ways of working that may be attractive to high achievers or those looking for a different relationship with work. And as mentioned before, the conventional wisdom for nonprofits is under question, if not, frankly, under siege. The conventional wisdom for nonprofit employees is, first, that nonprofit workers donate labor in exchange for meaningful work. You are paid less in exchange for feeling good about what you are doing with your time. The second part of the conventional wisdom is that nonprofit workers just want to do good. You are intrinsically motivated, and higher job satisfaction is tied to work benefits other than financial rewards. So this conventional wisdom has some merit, and there are several studies out there that have presented data to validate these common assumptions. But there is also a growing pile of data that calls this into question, not to mention that growing millennial influence in shaping work to meet their expectations for both meaning and meaningful rewards.
Oh, she's got her cold.
Somebody needs to mute. I'm not sure who's on how that happened, but someone needs to mute, please. Thank you. Some data show that pay is not so much divided by nonprofit versus for-profit, but rather organization size, type of organization, and type of role. So for these and for many other reasons, nonprofits certainly cannot fall back on old assumptions or old models in order to attract and keep their people. I will get into more results from the survey shortly, but here's one foundational finding to kick us off. In this survey of nonprofit professionals, 41% of them indicated that they are considering leaving their organizations within the next 12 months. And only 38% said that they are 100% committed to building a career in the nonprofit sector. An additional 42% say that they will only leave the sector for the right professional opportunity, but each of these further hints at how important it is to do what we can in our organizations to keep our top talent. We are helping several clients here at the Alfred Group right now, organizations that need to take hard looks at their staffing structures and the ways that they work to recruit and retain employees. So often, nonprofits do not have a robust human resources platform, and thus managers in the organization are left to figure it out on their own. And in many cases, we see that they are simply not figuring it out, or they've accepted that their best people will only stay 18 to 24 months. But what if we could recruit more rock stars and then actually keep those rock stars, even if it's for another year? That could make a big difference in what an organization can accomplish. So that brings us to the core question that I explored in this study. What does drive job choices for nonprofit employees? And to bring back the social performance element here, how much does it matter to nonprofit employees whether their employers have strong social mission-related performance? Does the mission-related success of an organization actually play a role in recruitment or retention? Is there a difference for employees between doing good and making actual change? Do nonprofit workers and recruits feel that they have meaningful access to that information that would help them make those job choices? So this study was built on two key constructs. First, the employee value proposition. The employee value proposition, so named by Brett Minchington, is a set of associations and offerings provided by an employer organization in return for the skills, capabilities, and experiences an employee brings to that organization. The employee value proposition, or EVP, is made up of 5 key elements: pay and compensation, benefits, affiliation, work content, and career support. I'm going to define each of these briefly as it is important to understanding the survey findings. First, pay and compensation. So this includes base salary, any incentive pay or bonuses, also the process by which you get paid, and the transparency of pay ranges within your organization. So this includes all things related to pay and compensation. Second, benefits. This includes health insurance, retirement benefits, recognition for good work, paid time off, family friendliness, tuition reimbursement, subsidies for parking, transportation, health, things like that. Third, affiliation. Now, affiliation is the who I work for and what that says about me. That's those aspects of employment, like external image and reputation of the organization, the internal culture and identity, and the environmental and values drivers of behavior and norms that define the organization from the inside out. Fourth, work content. This represents many of the what and why aspects of employment. The work an employee does, her agency in doing that work, the meaning she derives from the work, the organizational structure, and how the organization defines and measures performance. Lastly, career support. This includes advancement opportunities, personal growth, learning and development, training, job security, the title, mentorship opportunities, and the opportunity to work with thought leaders. So collectively, these are the employee value proposition, but what we'll see is different parts of these matter in different amounts to employees. The second key construct is social performance measurement. Each nonprofit, of course, could attempt to measure at each of the levels listed here. So to define those, just so that we're all on the same page of what we used in the research, inputs refer to the tools that the organization has to do its work: funds, equipment and supplies, knowledge, technical expertise. Activities are what the organization does, actions it takes, such as delivery of services, access provided, or infrastructure built. Outputs are the immediate results of the activities in terms of numbers of people engaged, such as number of people trained or fed or housed. Outcomes are the changes that actually took place, usually medium and long-term results for individuals, such as skills built or improvements in health. And lastly, impacts, which are effects on root causes, measured in terms of communities, populations, or ecosystems. Often these are communicated as changes in rates, like poverty rates or obesity rates for a given population. So, I conducted a survey of professionals working in charitable nonprofits who have been in their roles at least 6 months and have worked in the nonprofit sector for at least a year. We recruited them via email and social networks and ended up with a sample size of 338 individual respondents. When it came to looking at the different EVP drivers, the findings were quite consistent across all of the study's measures. When asking respondents how important each of the EVP elements was in their decision to accept their current position, work content, the what and why of their jobs, was a clear priority. 46% of respondents ranked it as the #1 factor, and 75% ranked it as one of their top 2 priorities. So almost half of respondents said that this was the top reason that they accepted their position, and 3/4 said it was either the first or second priority in accepting their current position. When looking at their satisfaction with the different EVP elements, respondents had the highest levels of satisfaction with affiliation and work content. While all ratings skewed toward the positive for respondents, pay and compensation and career support were on the lower end. The trend was very similar for respondents' ratings of their current employers in comparison to comparable organizations, with affiliation and work content again coming in at #1 and #2 respectively in terms of how their organizations performed against comps. We saw our first deviation from work content and affiliation being tops when we asked respondents how the EVP elements stacked up in terms of their importance in the respondent's decision whether to stay in their current position. Here, work content was #1, but pay and compensation came in second. Nearly 70% of respondents chose work content as one of the 2 most impactful factors on whether to stay in their current position, and 51% chose pay and compensation as one of the 2 most important factors. What the nonprofit workers do and how much they get paid to do it, in other words, were the top retention factors. This finding was further reinforced by qualitative comments, where we asked the 41% of respondents who indicated that they are considering leaving their job in the next year what their employers could do to increase their likelihood to stay with the organization. Those strategies again came back to themes of work content and pay/compensation at the top. We asked a number of questions about social performance, but here are 2 key findings that start to help us answer our question of how much it matters to nonprofit employees whether their employers have strong social performance. The majority of respondents feel that they have a strong understanding of the results their organization creates and that their organization creates strong results. These 2 variables had a clear correlation, so in this data we see that those respondents who feel they understand how well their organization performs are more likely to believe that their organization performs well. This may have to do with the measurement practices of those organizations, certainly, but it does point toward an interesting piece that, knowledge is power, and certainly those who feel that they have a strong understanding are more likely, at least in this survey, to feel that performance was strong. So when we bring it all together, the data does point to social performance as a driver of employee value in the respondents' high priority areas of work content and affiliation. These were the areas of the highest correlation between the respondents' belief in how well their organizations deliver on their missions with respondent satisfaction and comparative rating of their employers. This definitely calls for further research, as social performance measurement is still a growing and evolving area of study in terms of mainstream nonprofits incorporating it into their day-to-day work. And as Karen mentioned at the outset, we are happy to share the full paper, and so there are more details that will be coming that if you want to dig into some of these correlations and things more. So what do we do with this data to actually put it into practice? In recruitment, the bottom line is to focus on work content and affiliation by turning the dial way up on the what, why, and who of the role and the organization. For work content, that means being very clear and very specific about the role and working in how the role will specifically drive the mission of the organization and how the organization measures its individual and collective performance. As I talked about a few minutes ago, those who know about their organization's social performance are more likely to believe it performs well. If they can see how their performance will link directly to organizational performance, those who are driven to create results are more likely to be interested in such a role. For affiliation, it means being authentic and communicating about the organization's mission, values, identity, and purpose. It means proactively curating the employer's image, which requires creativity, especially when many nonprofits do not have human resources support to do so. And it means engaging recruits in the organizational culture and talking to them about how the organization does things and what it is committed to in terms of standards and practices in diversity, inclusion, innovation, and other values-related topics. If there is an opportunity to show rather than tell by having the recruit experience something real and meaningful, the recruit is more likely to want to be affiliated with the organization. A lot of times that can mean the heartstring stuff and allowing them to see programs or beneficiaries in action, but it doesn't have to be. If your organization is great at design thinking, is there an opportunity for recruits to sit in on a design session? If your organization is walking the talk on inclusion internally and externally, is there an authentic way for them to experience that? These practices are important not only in putting the organization's best face forward in engaging potential applicants, it is perhaps even more important to put the organization's truest face forward, because that will increase the likelihood of a long-term fit with a prospective employee who can make a better employment decision with better information. Once we have the people we want, nonprofits have 3 specific areas worth focusing on with current employees. For work content, it is walking the talk and keeping promises, even the soft promises, from the recruitment process in terms of what is expected of the employee and how they can shape their work to best advance their own and the organization's performance. I have several contacts who have complained to me recently about their job descriptions not matching their realities. This is a thorn in the side of the employee, as they may not feel that what they do is clear, or that all they do is recognized, or that the work isn't appropriately distributed between them and their colleagues. And while job description updates can feel like a burden to managers, they are also a pathway toward greater clarity of expectations and accountability, especially when done in tandem with performance measurement. I think we're all pretty used to static job descriptions that don't say much, And we're all pretty used to performance measurement tools that don't really track or build toward results. So let's not do it that way. Being clear about a set of expectations for employees, the knowledge, skills, and abilities they need to be successful, and the expectations for how they apply them to create a specific set of results. That's what we should be focusing on. Old formats be damned. The important thing is mutual understanding and clear accountabilities. Certainly we need to create artifacts of those discussions and we need to write it down, but it's more important that these conversations are happening and that we have that mutual understanding between employer and employee, because so often that is what is a thorn in their side if that is not there. For pay, well, we all know that this can be tough to budge as a topic, not only because of scarcity of resources, but also because of political pressures to keep administrative costs low. For pay, much of what organizations can do, no matter their resources, is to be transparent about compensation structures and how they align with performance and advancement opportunities, as well as exploring alternative compensation structures where possible. While nonprofits have additional restrictions on things like commissions for fundraising, there are still opportunities to bonus and otherwise reward staff. And very importantly, getting managers and supervisors the training or the coaching they need to talk with their teams about this topic. Most of us have had painful conversations as managers and with our managers about pay. The manager's not prepared, they say the wrong thing, they make it about them. There are lots of problems that can happen with even the best intended, best prepared manager when discussing this topic. So we need to help managers talk about it. We need to make sure that they have the information they need and prepare them to have a straightforward, productive conversation with their people, frankly at a moment's notice, because I think most of us have had this scenario where those conversations aren't always planned in advance. Finally, for affiliation, it comes to, again, walking the talk and doing so by ensuring employees are engaged in advancing the image of the organization from the inside out, including providing feedback, having relevant and robust engagement programs, and upholding and evolving standards for diversity, inclusion, and innovation. We work with a lot of organizations on crafting their vision statements and their strategic plans, as well as creating diversity and inclusion programs. Certainly the fear of these sitting on a shelf or hanging on a wall without actually being infused into the culture and strategies of the organization, well, it's a big fear and a real bummer for when it happens for all involved, to say the least. So we are always pushing for these statements and these plans to be built in such a way that they reflect the intentions of the organization, that they can and will be put into practice. It is more about the content of them being real and realistic and authentic rather than it is about them being flashy and impressive. We need full conscious organizational change to make these pieces come to life rather than just feeling like frosting on a stale cake. So this study pointed toward several potential drivers of recruitment and retention success for nonprofits by creating value for employees. It also points toward the potential for social performance measurement and communication to play a significant role in creating employee value. These indicators point to several questions worth further exploration. Certainly further research would be helpful, but these also speak to areas for further exploration within our organizations. And they present some opportunities to develop, prototype, and test some new strategies to find out more about what works in your organizations, your teams, and with the people that you aim to recruit and retain. First, what types of measurement practices do make a significant difference for employee recruitment and retention. In other words, when we measure our performance, we often think about what funders need to see and what we need to see to make improvements. But should it go further in connecting employee performance to organizational performance in mission-based terms? Second, how should nonprofit employers communicate their social performance results in order to drive employee value? Again, we think about communicating it to funders and constituents and prospective funders and prospective constituents, but do we make a conscious, intentional effort to communicate this to employees in terms that are meaningful to them? I recently spoke with a fundraiser who said, I'm so focused on bringing in the dollars that sometimes I'm not actually sure what we're accomplishing. I have the things that I need to give to funders, but I'm not really sure what makes us great at our job and why they should invest in us versus someone else. And certainly there was a tinge of in that conversation of, if not regret, certainly longing for that person to know more and to stir up further pride that he could funnel into his conversations with funders, as well as his own thoughts about his job and how he makes the choice to stay or not. Third, what are the most powerful ways to communicate organizational impact actively and passively to reach potential employee candidates? How do we make our effectiveness part of our employer brand, and how do we show candidates what that actually means? And tactically, how do we actually implement these practices within interviews and throughout the hiring process? What practical actions can we take to best leverage the talent engine on which our organizations rely? So we want to close here, and certainly there's time to take some questions, with thinking about how to improve our chances at getting and keeping the best nonprofit talent. We've certainly found in this survey that the what and why of a person's job is very important. The who of their employer and how they feel about the employer's reputation internally and externally is very important. And then we need to think about, especially for retention, the pay and compensation issue, not only about fair pay or adequate pay, but also how we talk about that in an organization and how transparent that is. I've been working with a couple different organizations that advocate for fair and equal pay in their missions, and so by having that as part of their actual social impact that they're creating, they have a higher standard within their organizations to understand and communicate about that, and the ability for them to walk the talk internally. And any lack of transparency or lack of acknowledgement of the need to walk that talk can be met with certainly folks shortening their tenure with the organization. So hopefully this information is interesting and useful to you, and there is some more to read if you care to dig into the full academic research that we will share with you, but we do have some time if there are any questions to take at this point.
Well, thank you so much, Diane. It's such a timely topic for so many of us, and in the sector, with the amount of turnover in light of all of the reports, the underdeveloped reports, and others about turnover. There are a few questions that came through I'd like to put out to you, if I may. The first one is, were there any surprises in this research?
Yeah, that's a good question. As are all questions. The actual findings were not that surprising. It wasn't necessarily exactly with where I thought that it would shake out, but in terms of the preliminary research that I had done, it made sense that the pay issue was going to come into play, but that a lot of folks who are accepting nonprofit positions are doing so because of the nature of the work or because of their desire to be affiliated with an organization that does what they do. So those pieces were not very surprising, but there was one piece that was a little bit surprising, which really kind of calls for some further exploration, and that is in asking what the social performance measurement activities were of the respondents' employer organizations. They reported very high levels of measurement. So at least half of the respondents reported that they were measuring at each of the levels. So inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and even impact. So 52.4% of them reported that their organizations were measuring impact. And that's a little surprising in terms of what we see in a lot of organizations and the nature of the organizations. Oftentimes it can be difficult to measure impact, especially if the organization is not really working on a population or community level issue. So So that was a bit surprising, and we think there might be two reasons for that. So one of them could be that we had a sample that skewed towards the more sophisticated in terms of measurement. I mean, certainly it's not hard to imagine there would be a little sampling bias based on the nature of the survey and the nature of the people that we might have sent it to. They may be more further along in terms of that measurement, or it may be that the question wasn't worded as well as it could have been. So, that's something that was a little surprising to see everyone, a clear majority saying that they were measuring at these very high levels. It's great. I hope it's true, but it seemed a little bit higher than what we expected. So I think the research base around measurement, so the research around research, the research around what organizations are doing, nonprofits, how they're measuring impact, at what level, the kind of resources they're using, is still a relatively new piece of the evidence base. And so it'll be really fascinating to see in the coming years how outcomes measurement gets studied itself. And how we see that further drive the behaviors of organizations in measuring their impact.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question from someone in the audience here. They're asking, in your research, do you see differences in the results based on organization size, or this question says nonprofit industry? I would assume that means or sector. Would you see differences in size or sector? There were some differences. Not too many that really made a difference in the sense of how they responded. The trends were, fairly consistent. Again, there were some areas that may have been a little overrepresented in our sample. So just a quick review of some of the demographics. So the sample was spread pretty evenly across generations. So we had about a third millennials, about a third Gen X, and about a third baby boomers. The sample was predominantly white and female and very highly educated. So those are things to consider. In terms of the sectors, though, I'm just looking to see where my data is. Oh, here we go. So the employer organizations represented by respondents were most commonly human services with about 31%. Education was about 20%, and health was about 11%, followed by arts, culture, and humanities at 10%. So in terms of the sample was not evenly distributed across all
sectors. So, so with that in mind, we didn't necessarily see dramatic differences amongst, there weren't trends that went necessarily by those sectors. So acknowledging that the sample wasn't perfect in terms of distribution, we also didn't find a lot of difference in terms of how they answered based on the sectors that they were in.
Okay. Here's another one for you, Diane. If a nonprofit was to do one thing to improve our recruitment and retention efforts, what would that be?
I'm going to answer that it's the boring answer. Fix your job descriptions. It's something that, both from this research and also anecdotally through our work here at the Alfred Group, it's just something that's coming up so often, and it seems, frankly, pretty mundane, but I think it's not really about the piece of paper. I think it's about people feeling that they have clear and mutually understood expectations for what their job entails, what other people's jobs entail, how they should team with others, and ultimately what that drives in terms of value for the organization, and not just, like soft, squishy value, like I feel good about that I'm getting thanked. I mean, that matters, of course that matters, but also how can I draw a line between my work and the actual performance of this organization? Are kids getting less sick because of what I do? Are people getting housed and fed? Are we making progress on environmental outcomes? How can I tie what I do to that? Even if it is indirectly, even if it is contribution to a much greater whole, which it usually is. So often job descriptions and the things that go along with them, whether they're competency models or other kinds of materials that an organization may have, if a manager can't articulate in a meaningful way how their employees' efforts tie toward the actual mission of the organization, then that's a problem. And we see it a lot in a lot of organizations where that's not possible. It doesn't mean it's not actually happening, but they just haven't lined those things up. I recently had a client ask about, we were doing strategic planning for them, and they said, how far do we need to go in terms of tying this to performance, to individual performance? And we said, strategic plan is not a performance measurement, tool exactly, but if those things aren't linked to one another, it's the capacity of your people, not only time and, those kinds of capacities, but also the knowledge, the skills, the abilities. If those capacities aren't aligned, well, we're dead in the water. We're not going to be able to advance that strategic plan. So if your strategic plan had 5 key outcomes in it, then each person should know, or objectives in it, each employee should know what their job drives toward, at least one of them. Because if it doesn't, then it may be that they're not actually as valuable to the organization, or they're not understood to be driving value directly. So it's not what most of my colleagues in the nonprofit sector want to hear, or any sector want to hear, because job descriptions can be a drag. But I think if we reframe what that means and think about it as, do we have a clear understanding as an organization of what our people need to do to make us successful, and then we document that in whatever format that should be, then I think we're getting somewhere.
That's excellent, Diane. And like you say, it is stating the obvious, isn't it? But if people feel that their work is tying to the greater good, there's a lot more job satisfaction. That's great. Great answer. There are 2 questions here that are very similar, so I'll try to sort of combine how they tie together. And it's to ask you for any advice how to balance paying our staff well and the pressure from donors to keep operating costs low. Many funders are wanting their dollars going to direct services versus indirect services. And so how would you advise people in terms of that, in terms of fundraising for that?
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely a trade-off between paying well and keeping overhead low. I think many of us certainly have our feelings about overhead and how it's looked at and still often too simplistically by certain funders. But even as that evolves and we get more understanding about the necessity of overhead, it's so much about communicating how, just to what I was saying before, communicating how these individuals' jobs do actually drive toward the outcomes. Even if we can't, quote unquote, count them as programmatic expenses, how does this actually drive value to the program, to the organizational outcomes? And I think oftentimes when we separate organizational outcomes from program outcomes, we can find a little bit of room there. So as an organization, if we are getting funded for what we do and we're really clear about the outcomes that we're driving, then that's a place where we can get a little more consideration for our staff in their organizational roles versus when we look at the silo of a program, which certainly some funders are only going to look at that, but when they only will, then they're only seeing, the activities of that program and not all of the things that actually drive the organization's success. We hosted a panel, I think it was in December, at a conference, and somebody asked a similar question to one of our funders. I believe it was the gal from Northern Trust, and asked about funding overhead and they didn't say it that way, but funding expenses that were not directly program related. And she said, I am happy to help you keep the lights on if you make a really good case for how what I'm funding keeps the lights on, and why the lights need to be kept on. And so she was talking about, of course, infrastructure and operations, but it certainly comes back to that, communication burden of, if we are really clear and we have the data to show how people's performance drives program or organizational performance, we have a much better shot at getting funders to see that as well, and then making those trade-offs internally to make the math work. And I go back to, a lot of organizations can't pay what they would like to pay to their team members, but having that transparency within the organization about what pay is based on, how pay and performance do or do not tie to one another, and what pay means in the grander scheme of the budget of the organization can really go a long way. I've worked with a number of organizations, and I've frankly been in some organizations where we didn't have any information that wasn't required to be public. And so there was a lot of mistrust, and there was a lot of misunderstanding of, well, what would that raise do to our bottom line? Tell me more. Why is this a challenge? So it's really working at multiple levels, but I do think it comes back to having organizational level outcomes and really driving individual performance, really matching individual performance with driving those outcomes, and then communicating that to not only the employees but also to funders, and trying to get them to see a bigger piece of the story in how we finance our outcomes.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Diane. And thank you for sharing the key drivers of nonprofit employee recruitment and retention, and for this research that you've conducted over the last 11 months. It's fantastic. And, I just want to remind people that the information will be available. We hope you found this information useful, and will use it to win over and keep the talent you need to continue having an impact in your communities and across the country. Keep an eye out today for an email that will link you to the recording of today's presentation, the full slide deck, and the full research report. And then we would like to ask you, please, if you would take the time to complete a very short survey to tell us how we did. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. This concludes today's webinar, and we will now disconnect. Thank you. Have a great day.